Now that we are done with our SQL installation, let's still continue with some theoretical intuition before we then now move on to our server for some hands-on. Now remember I talked about the data manipulation language and various clauses under the data manipulation language, select being one of them. Now let's look how the select works. Select basically can be used for projection, meaning that you could select columns in a table being returned by a query, or you could select a few or as many as the columns that are required. Select can also be used for selections, meaning I could select the rows in a table that are returned by a query using various criteria to restrict the data that is being retrieved. We're going to talk about that in the next module. Finally, the select clause can be used for joining, that is, bringing data together that is stored in different tables by specifying the link between them. Okay, now I really do not want to get you overwhelmed with all this, but let's focus on the projection part. Now, how does select work? Let's take, for example, that you wanted to bake a cake and you must have written down a couple of ingredients that would be needed in making that cake. Now, you take this list to a grocery store and you then now start picking various ingredients from various aisles of various shelves. Now, taking this intuition back to the select statement, how select works is you are either picking some selected columns based on instructions that have been given to you. Now, when you try to use the select statement or when you try to write a select statement, the first thing that comes is a select clause. Now, the next clause after the select is definitely a from. So basically, you are selecting from a certain object. In this case, this object would be a table. Now, there are two ways you might want to carry out this select clause. It's either you want to select everything from a particular table, and what I mean everything, I'm talking about all the columns, all the rows without restricting anything. Now, in this case, if we wanted to select all columns from a table, then you need to make use of the star notation. Star here means all. So what this SQL query reads here is select all from. Select star from, which reads select all from. So in this case, what this SQL statement would return is all the columns from the table and all the rows from the table. Now let's look at how this is being used. So you can see a very simple SQL query here that just basically selects all from a certain table name. Yeah, you might be wondering what is schema actually looking for in that particular SQL query. So the Microsoft SQL Server makes use of the schema table naming convention. So what that means is before I need to get data from a table, I need to specify the owner of that table, which is schema from our last video. So every time you need to get data from a particular table on the Microsoft SQL Server, right, you need to specify who the owner of that table is, which is what? Which is the schema. Remember I said that a schema is associated with a user name. So in this case, so let's assume that I want to get all the employees record from a particular table called employee. However, the employee table is belonging to the HR schema. So what that means is I need to specify who the owner of the employee table is, which is HR, which is the schema. So if I wanted to write an SQL query for that, I would say select star from HR dot employee, HR being the schema, employee being the table. So when getting data from the Microsoft SQL Server, you need to make use of the schema table naming convention separated by a dot. Now, another way to get data from the table is by specifying various column names as defined by either your manager or whoever is making the request. So let's say, for example, your manager comes in and say, oh, I need you to get me data from a certain table. And he then now lists all the column name, or he lists some specific column names from that table. Now, when you want to write your SQL query, you need to say select whatever the name for column 1 is with a comma, whatever the name for column 2 is with a comma, and so on to the X number of columns you have been given to get data from. And after that, you then now say from schema.table name. So let's say, for example, my manager comes in and says, I want you to get me data from the employees table, but this data should contain probably employees' first name, employees' last name, employees' hire date, and employees' salary. Now, in this case, my manager is not telling me to return all the columns from that particular table. However, he has specified some certain columns he wants data from, which are the first name, the last name, the salary column, and the hire date. So what that means is I should then now write a query that looks like select first name, comma, last name, comma, salary, comma, hire date, comma, from HR dot employee. Now, all these things sound so theoretical. Let's go back to our server and put this into practice using a couple of business questions. Now that we have understood how to write a select statement, either by getting all the data from a table or by specifying some columns and getting the data for those columns, let's now put this into the practice. Here, I am working on my own Microsoft SQL server, and I also do believe that you must have gotten your installation properly. Now let's look at the first business question here, which says, get all the data from the product table. Now, first off, this business question highlighted in green is a comment. So comments are basically not meant to run. They just give you an idea as to what you're working on. And it's usually a best practice to comment your code so that it makes it easier for you to understand and also makes it easier for other persons to understand. There are two ways to write a comment. Either you want to write a comment in a single line, just like you can see on line 1 here is a single line comment. And one way to show that you are writing comments on a single line is by using at least 2 broken dashes, just the way you can see here. Another way to write a comment is writing comments on a multiple line, just you can see from line 5 to line 7. And one way to specify that you're writing comments on a multiple line is by using the backward slash and star, and also star with the backward slash, right? So take note of this and also take note of this. Now let's see how we can then now solve the first business question to get all the data from the product table. If I expanded on my databases here and I expanded on system databases, and I go to my master database, which is the database I'm working with, and I go to tables. Now I can see that we have a table called products, right? However, this table called product is belonging to the sales LT schema. You can see what I was talking about from the previous video, right? So the product table belongs to the sales LT schema. So what that means is for me to get data from the product table, I need to make a reference to the schema first using the dot notation. Now let's write the score, right? So here I'm trying to get all the data from the product table without restrictions. So what that means is it starts with select. Since I'm getting all, I would say star, and it's coming from the name of the table is called product table, but it also belongs to the sales LT schema. So I need to call the sales LT schema first. Then I would say dot product. Great. Now I just have to highlight where I have the actual code and execute. And tada, we then now have all the data from the product table. You can see all the columns returned, 295 rows without restriction. So this is what getting data using the start notation, which gets all the columns, all the rows from that particular table. Now, the second business question here is my manager have listed some couple of columns I need to get data from, and he has specified that I get the data from columns like the product name, the product ID, the list price, and the standard cost for all the products. Now, to make this so very much easy for me, I'm going to expand on the product table here. I'm going to columns here and check all the columns, right? So I have the product ID here. I have the name, not product name, I have name. I have standard cost, and I also have list price. Now, one thing about the Microsoft SQL Server is that the Microsoft SQL Server is so forgiving, right? So I really do not need to write product ID exactly the way it is written, right? I really do not need to write standard cost exactly the way it's written, meaning that on the Microsoft SQL Server, columns are actually not case sensitive, right? But I need to use the matching column name. In this case, for example, we do not have product name. What we have is a name. So we have to be very careful when writing that code, right? So as usual, it starts with what? Select in no particular order, right? I could say name, I could say product ID, then I could say list price, I could say standard cost. Now you can see how I have separated every of the column with a comma except the last column, right? Now, where are all these coming from? All these are coming from sales LT dot product. Great. Now, having done this, I can then now run the code. So if I highlighted this and execute, I then now have all the data coming from these four specific columns: name, product ID, list price, and standard cost in no particular order. Right. So this is it, right? Whatever you have on your select clause would be what exactly would be displayed. What does that mean? Meaning that if I said select standard cost, list price, the name, and the product ID from sales LT dot product would return what exactly I have specified in my select clause, right? So you really don't have to be specific or particular about which of the column comes first. The main thing is you are writing your select clause, you are separating every columns by a comma except the last column. After the last column comes your from clause and your schema name dot your table name. Right. It's as simple as that. Congratulations on writing your first select